Here's a question for you to ponder. Has Roman Reigns flopped? He's a babyface, of course, and yet when he's not flanked by the Shield, and that would be Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose, fans almost universally despise him. It's hard to grasp why at this point. He no longer spouts lame nonsense like Sufferin' Succotash or Tater Tots, and he delivers big time in virtually every match he's a part of. He doesn't really bury opponents either, be that out of ineptitude or malice, as his predecessor John Cena sometimes did seem to revel in. Even the people that like him, however, must bristle at the sheer lengths WWE do go to protect him. For example, remember that TLC Go Home edition of Raw? He absorbed a ridiculous amount of punishment. And ultimately, that's probably it. Everything about the push is so contrived that it hardly matters how good he actually is. WWE is so concerned with telling us that Reigns is the guy that even when he shows it, this all-out assault undermines him, and we, the fan, don't care. But to his credit, Reigns does get a reaction at least when he comes out. He works great matches, but that is the bare minimum for a man in his position in 2018. He's a star, but at the moment, he's no John Cena if we're talking about the drawing department. And while the verdict will always be inconclusive, as a general rule of thumb, unless you're Brock Lesnar, the next big thing tag is always the proverbial kiss of death. My name is Simon from WhatCulture, and this is the 10 next big things in wrestling that totally flopped. Number 10, Drew McIntyre. Now, I love Drew McIntyre, and you can go watch a Why video where I say one day he's going to be WWE Champion, because one day he is going to be WWE Champion, and famously, Vince McMahon even said that too. Drew McIntyre was the chairman of the board's chosen one. Unfortunately, at the time of that, his presentation was at odds with his ability level. McIntyre was a product of FCW, and it showed. Nothing separated him from his peers mechanically, and he struggled to project his idealized character to arena-sized crowds. He did have a killer entrance theme, but that did not make a killer. And yeah, Drew looked the part, but unfortunately he drew unfavourable comparisons to one Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Trust me, that is never good. Just as quickly as we were asked to accept him in a position above his status, he was buried well below the centre of the earth following some controversy with then-wife Taryn Terrell and something that happened in a hotel room. I'm not going to say any more about it, because I wasn't there. He was then recast as a comedy drama in 3MB, and that was that. He was a walking punishment. Happily, Drew, then known as Drew Galloway, subsequently transformed himself, and fittingly, he did kind of become like a next-generation Triple H. As he developed a more bruising, no-nonsense, shit-kicking persona on the independent circuit, he also put on some muscle, and he basically became a wrestler that WWE would love. McIntyre was a flop, but Galloway was a phoenix, and the man is now surely immune to further burials and has everything going for him as he moves forward throughout his wrestling life. Number 9, Sin Cara. Sin Cara was Triple H's first guy in his guise of developmental head honcho. To his credit, on paper, the signing of the former Mystico was a very sound one. With Rey Mysterio's knee in a proper state, Cara, who was already an incredibly popular in-ring performer, was his natural successor. Unfortunately, whether it was through sheer belief in his own ability or cynically a rush to cover himself in glory via osmosis, Trips elected not to send Cara to developmental. He instead learned how to wrestle on the left side, because luchadors work on the right side, during the house show circuit for a brief on-the-job training exercise. As became painfully apparent, this was not sufficient. Cara botched his very first entrance, misjudging the trajectory of his trampoline ramp. Then came the in-ring botches. Cara in Mexico was a tornado of convoluted rotations. In WWE, he was an unnatural, ungainly disaster, singularly failing to deploy even the most rudimentary of good lucha things. Thanks, Callisto. To put into perspective just how disastrous all this was, Cara is usually in the running for a Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame spot simply because of how good he was in CMLL. And all this happened after he did everything that he did do in WWE, as fans watched him fall over again, and again. It got so bad, no one called him Sin Cara, they called him Botch Cara. That's not that original, it's quite funny. Number 8, Alberto Del Rio. Much like Sin Cara, Alberto Del Rio was meant to be WWE's next great inroad into the Hispanic market in 2010. Instead, he failed to grab the attention of the wider WWE fan base on 2 separate occasions. His is surely the most puzzling story of an act working so bloody well on paper, but failing to translate its qualities to the screen. The gimmick was certain to work, and it was expertly calibrated to work. Del Rio was the 1%. Del Rio was so above the rest of us mere mortals that he hired his own personal ring announcer. Del Rio was so rich he had a different car in every city. And on top of all this, he could wrestle as well. His striking and submission savvy cast him as an intense sociopath, but for reasons that continue to baffle, none of this really resonated. Short of any right answer to a tricky conundrum, only the most basic of takes applies. He just didn't have it. His next gimmick as a citizen of Mex America was the complete opposite of this, because that was destined to fail from day one. It was kind of like a Latin-flavoured racist but not racist Muhammad Hassan. Was he a babyface or was he a heel? Nobody knew, and the only thing we did know for sure is that WWE somehow contrived to lumber him with something even worse afterwards: the League of Nations. It was so ridiculous and stereotyped, we may as well have called them the miscellaneous evil foreigners. But we didn't do that. At least that would have been funny. Number 7, Vladimir Kozlov. It's hard to write Vladimir Kozlov off as a monster of the week in retrospect. The Undertaker defeated those monsters. Kozlov defeated The Undertaker during his unwelcome march to the WWE main event. And I don't mean this on some random C show, I mean the proper headline slot. What the hell was going on? And all this happened despite Kozlov possessing zero traits to prove his suitability for the role. He could barely wrestle, he didn't have that good a physique, and there was so little menace to his act that any attempts to convey an intensity came across as comedy. In short, Kozlov was simply a dud, and yet he was a performer that Vince McMahon loved, as if it was the second coming of Ivan Koloff, when in truth, Ludwig Borger was a closer comparison. Vince was all in on his push though, and you've got to give him that. This wasn't the inconsistent, counterproductive 50-50 booking we would come to shrug our shoulders at today. McMahon went in 100%, even though this was 100% a stupid idea. Can you imagine if Cesaro was pushed with even a fraction of this conviction? He would be a superstar. Perhaps the failed Kozlov experiment hastened McMahon's now legendary impatience, and if so, what a mundane and frankly avoidable hill to die on. Number 6, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, in his brief and temporary pomp, was one of wrestling's last true love-to-hate heels. He simply oozed that dickhead gene character-wise, and he was really good on the microphone. You bought him as you were meant to. He was a nasty guy because he came across like a nasty guy. But work-wise, well, he was alright. He had ample opportunity to tear down the house, having been paired with several great workers during his initial mega push, but he never really caught on in that sense. And there is precedent for unforeseen improvement with guys like this, because old tagging partner MVP turned into a very good worker in front of our eyes. Unfortunately for Kennedy though, he lacked that truly memorable match to warrant this major push. As well as this, he also became a victim of backstage politicking and dreadfully unfortunate timing, if you subscribe to the conventional narrative. But in an age where several former talents, such as Cody Rhodes and Juice Robinson, are rising to the top, what has Kennedy done to create a clamour for his return? When rumours swirled that WWE planned on rehiring solid mid-card hands to help with the brand extension when it came back, Kennedy's name was never even mentioned. Think of that. Number 5, Bob Sapp. Bob Sapp epitomised the unbelievable decline of New Japan Pro Wrestling in the early 2000s and the almost indulgent nadir of former booker Antonio Inoki's increasingly narrow vision for pro wrestling. To an extent, you can see the logic. Japan was gripped by MMA fever in the wake of Pride Fighting Championship's smash success, and there was scope and an idea to incorporate such realism into a wider market. The UWFI group, for example, which astutely marketed itself as the real pro wrestling league, was a major player in the massively lucrative 1990s scene. Sapp, who was Inoki's plan to revert back to its old spirit, was a charismatic freak show attraction elevated by genuine credibility. The problem was that Pride was legit, pro wrestling obviously wasn't. And now that the Japanese audience had seen real fights, transposing this ethos to pro wrestling was only ever going to fail. The other folly of this strategy was exposed when Sapp, tasked with carrying the IWGP Heavyweight title, was forced to relinquish it when he lost a shoot fight to Fujita. And while the UWFI's champion, Takada, had a hardman rep that was carefully engineered over time, Sapp was handed a big gold belt, and then he lost it almost instantly. His flopping was literally inevitable. Number 4, The Ultimate Warrior. Every man's heart one day beats its final beat. His lungs breathe their final breath. And if what that man did in his life makes the blood pulse through the body of others and makes them believe deeper in something larger than life, then his essence, his spirit, will be immortalized. And yes, those were the Warrior's last on-screen words, and as fitting and prescient as they were, his legacy is etched, if not into the Mount Rushmore of WWE, then somewhere into stone. Because if we're honest with ourselves, Warrior's sole reign with the then WWF Heavyweight title did flop critically and commercially. The former wasn't of great concern to the Federation at the time. If it were, there's no way McMahon would have chosen a worker of his clumsy and basic ill to carry it in the first instance. The all-important box office figures, though, floundered in parallel despite the best efforts of Rick Rude. House show gates plummet and pay-per-view buy rates followed the same pattern. And many factors converged to create this implosion, which caught the company itself in its backdraft. Hulk Hogan reacted to Warrior's title victory at WrestleMania 6 as if he was about to die, and that Warrior's 2.9 count was not so much a fluke, but a sporting disgrace. His magnanimity cast Warrior as his little brother too, and his whole cartoonish escapade had few genuine title challenges with which to spike fan enthusiasm. It's a testament, however, to how absolutely indelible Warrior was as a performer, because his legacy obscures the numbers. Number 3, The Big Show. In 1999, Paul White arrived in the WWF with virtually every quality necessary to achieve lasting headliner success. He was an actual giant which checked the biggest box for Vince McMahon, only he's a giant that could perform a damn moonsault. He could talk and was naturally funny, which is another thing that Vince McMahon likes. Gotta be entertaining, pal. Gotta be entertaining. Finally, for a man of his frame and middle experience, he could work, or at least manage to convince people he could work, which is more or less the same thing. White arrived in the WWE though with some literal baggage, because he had piled on the pounds during the end of his WCW tenure. His lean physique had become a little bit bloated. When the time came to remove the flattering black t-shirt and jeans, his switch from the Andre singlet to high-rise trunks created the unfortunate impression of a sumo wrestler. It was a poor choice of garb. His later WrestleMania 21 sumo match opposite Akabono was one of several humiliations to which the man was subjected when it became apparent that he lacked the motivation and talent to hack it at the top. At least that's what people said. McMahon's 10-year investment kinda tanked, and while he has forged a fine living for himself and has reached legendary status, you got to admit, we all did expect maybe a little bit more. Number 2, Bray Wyatt. What is left to write about Bray Wyatt? I mean, fans were actually happy when he got ill because it took him out of the program where he was told to dress up in drag. I think that kind of sums it up. Wyatt debuted on the main roster with much fanfare. He was a new, interesting and unique presence, unlike the hordes of normal, mere mortal wrestlers populating WWE. His entrance, for example, was spectacular, and the delivery of his promos was captivating enough to obscure all the gibberish. Don't forget too his matches after that pretty poor start against Kane, particularly those against Daniel Bryan and John Cena. But all of this was rendered moot when he continued to eat pin after pin, which drove the point home. Wyatt wasn't a cult leader, he was a charlatan whose brand of bullshit reeked after months of years of losing programs and having the gall to present himself as a major storyline threat. But he wasn't, because he kept losing. And it's hard to make the argument that Bray Wyatt's supernatural stick doesn't work in the modern day pro wrestling landscape, because fans plenty of times have wanted to follow his cult. They hold their smartphones aloft when he makes his entrance, and then despair when he routinely fails to deliver on all of his promises. WWE creative were trying to make the next Undertaker, and instead they made the next Vampiro. Number 1, Lex Luger. Vince McMahon loves reverting to type, which kind of explains why in 2017, the all of a sudden pumped up Jinder Mahal became the WWE Heavyweight Champion. In short, Vince just likes big dudes. And all of that also explains the great failed Lex Luger experiment of 1993. With Hulk Hogan on the way out and his smaller successors having failed to reach his industry-exploding heights, McMahon went all in on the Luger push. When he touched down on the deck of the USS Intrepid and laid out resident monster Yokozuna with a body slam, this was meant to tap into all your memories of the past and create Lex Luger as the future. Unfortunately, it didn't go that way, and the subsequent Lex Express tour was similarly poor. And really the problem was he was drawn to the fans and not the other way around, mostly because he didn't have that Hogan-esque magnetism. The sight of a jubilant Luger celebrating a tainted count-out win over Yoko at SummerSlam, with balloons raining down from overhead, was also neatly symbolic. It was an empty celebration for an empty push. And if you ever need to remember that sometimes the next big thing isn't going to work, just go and watch everything that happened with Lex Luger. Poor guy.
Well done, you made it all the way to the end of the video. Now, I'm not just here to increase our market share with women aged 18 to 35, but to tell you to watch one of these other videos we've made that are probably quite good. So, go on. That one or that one, they're both good. There you go.